And Urdu takes so much from English, from Farsi, from Hindi, from Bengali, in order to kind of think very actively about narratorial forms. So when I choose what I want to translate, I kind of try to move beyond the ethnographic demands that we as a majority, within a society make out of minority languages and literatures, and try to think at least more internally with Urdu in terms of how it reflects on its own literary styles, its own literary norms. So yeah, that is why I think of playfulness of style, of narratorial voices, of literary registers as more important than simply representing a kind of ethnographic experience.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Afterword Voices in Translation podcast. This is a podcast that celebrates the art of literary translation, exploring its joys and challenges while spotlighting the often invisible work of translators across India and the world. It celebrates literary translators and places their craft firmly in the spotlight. I'm your host, Mohini Gupta, and I'm really excited to bring to you these exciting journeys in translation across languages with every new episode. Today's episode is titled Urdu Subtle Echo in English, a session with Jaideep Pandey. And I have our guest for the podcast, who is an academic and literary translator. Jaideep is a research scholar in comparative literature at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He works on idioms of literary modernities, desire, and gender across Urdu, Persian, Arabic, and Hindi. His translations have appeared in the Journal of Urdu Studies, Rusted Radishes, Indian Literature, and in 2 volumes published by Routledge and Oxford University Press. His translation of Samina Nazir's Kallo won the 2024 Mori Prize for translations from Indian languages. He is also the translator of Siddiq Alam's Chini Koti, which was published as The Chinese Mansion in August 2025 by Hachette. Jaideep, we were, of course, earlier connected as fellow PhD students until last year. So it's really nice to speak to you today as a fellow translator. Thank you so much for making the time to talk to us on this podcast. And I'm not going to waste any more time and just dive right into it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And first of all, congratulations on the Mori Prize and the recent publication as well. It's been a really exciting year for you. Can you talk to us a little bit about the start of your academic and literary journey? And I wanted to understand if translation sort of came up as a part of your academic work in comparative literature, or was it something that you've been engaged with for a longer period of time? And maybe you can talk to us about your research work at this point as well. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mohini, for inviting me. It's truly great to be in conversation with you today. So to answer your question right away, I think translation was a part of my life for a very long time. I think for a lot of us who grow up in, for the lack of a better word, post-colonial societies, especially studying literature, I think right from the beginning, we are kind of immersed in the world of translation, whether consciously or unconsciously. So before moving into a comparative literature department, I was in an English literature department at the University of Delhi for 5 years, and then I also taught there for around 3 years. So, a translation is kind of organically a part of your life when you are studying English literature in India, not just because you're studying a literature of a language, of idioms, of locations that are very far away from you, but also because invariably you also end up comparing them to literatures of, written within India themselves. So even though I was in an English literature department, I think we continuously compared, for example, 19th century British novels, which a lot of us grow up on in India, with late 19th century versions of South Asian novels, like Bankim Chandra and many others that we encounter in our classrooms. So I think translation was a part of my both life and academic experience right since I started undergrad. But I think one thing that shifted very categorically once I moved into comparative literature is to see translation as something more than a means to end. I think a lot of times earlier on, I thought of translation as a way to access texts which I cannot, in their original languages. But I think when once I moved into comparative literature, I've started thinking translation more actively as a location from which literature is produced, read, and understood, not something that is kind of a transparent medium or a conduit between languages, but something that actively shapes how literature is written, read, circulated, responded to, and things like that. So I think that is a fundamental shift for me since moving into comparative literature. In terms of my research, I focus very squarely on translation. So the research topic itself is a little bit obscure, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But I work on a modern Urdu representations of medieval Muslim Spain. So yeah, so it is a little obscure. But what I do through this kind of representation of a past landscape from Europe in modern South Asia is to bring kind of various converging lines and networks of translation within South Asia. So when I look at how Urdu wrote about medieval Spain, I try to place Urdu into Arabic, Persian, English, Spanish, and a lot of these languages that it was either related to in the past or had formed new relationship with in the colonial present, and how being modern, reading and writing in a modern way in Urdu was framed through these translation kind of networks, as opposed to translation being something kind of just as a way of getting access to other kinds of texts. I try to think of Urdu's literary modernity as formed through the matrix of translation. So, yeah, so I think that's where my research stands as of now.
Really fascinating. And that journey from thinking about translation as a means to thinking about it as an end in itself, I think is itself very, very profound, I think. And also, you work across so many languages. The conversation today, of course, will be focused on your Urdu translations, but feel free to talk about your experience navigating these multiple languages that you work across as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I wanted to talk about the short story that won the Mori Prize. But also before that, maybe I want to ask you a little bit about your choices in translation. So your selection of the story Kallo or the book, The Chinese Mansion. What is it that you think ties your translation choices together? Is there something that draws you to these particular texts, or is there something that you look for in your source text when you're translating? Yeah, so is there something that you can see as a pattern in your translation choices?
Thank you. That's such a great question for me to think about my own translation choices. So I would say that inventiveness and playfulness of language is something that I am attracted to when I want to translate a text. I think that's particularly true for Urdu because, and this is my opinion, there might be contrary opinions to that, but I think Urdu, particularly in the Indian context, is subject to a lot of unnecessary ethnographic work that it is expected to do because the language is rendered, a minority language, and it is highly marginalized. It is made to kind of, represent a minority's experience over and over again. And there is value in that work because, of course, the question of representation for a mainstream is important. But there's also a long tradition in Urdu literature of playing with narrative styles and forms and registers and tones and voices, like any other literary tradition in that sense. And Urdu takes so much from English, from Farsi, from Hindi, from Bengali, in order to kind of think very actively about narratorial forms. So when I choose what I want to translate, I kind of try to move beyond the ethnographic demands that we as a majority, within a society make out of minority languages and literatures, and try to think at least more internally with Urdu in terms of how it reflects on its own literary styles, its own literary norms. So yeah, that is why I think of playfulness of style, of narratorial voices, of literary registers as more important than simply representing a kind of ethnographic experience in that sense.
That's a really incredible thought. And I guess that does bring me to the next question also about your relationship with the Urdu language. And when you talk about this inventiveness and playfulness, what do you feel you're able to capture really well in translation? Is that something that you feel is your forte when you're translating? What do you feel gets left out? Of course, we're always talking about what gets lost in translation, and I don't want to go down that cliche, but I am curious to know what you feel you're able to bring across really well and what you feel gets left out.
Thank you. That's a very good question for connecting kind of broad theory into practice, I think. So, beginning with my relationship with Urdu, I think as most other non-native speakers of Urdu in India, uh, began by thinking of Urdu as some kind of obscure language which needs a lot of saving, and which is not represented in the mainstream. And we are always surrounded by narratives of that Urdu is dying. Urdu is kind of losing ground in India. uh, I think once I actually started learning Urdu, I realized that Urdu is not really dying. It is just marginalized from the mainstream and it is actually thriving. There's a lot of circulation of Urdu texts, both past texts as well as new texts that are being written across South Asia, India, Pakistan, and I think it is just that we are closed off from that very thriving network because it is marginalized. So I think my relationship to Urdu has evolved over the period of time, which it began with a kind of uh, well guided but misplaced sense of charity towards a language you think is not represented well enough, to realizing that no, actually you are the one who's a student and trying to access a very world, very active, alive, robust world of literature. And I was especially struck by this when I was doing field work, archival work for a year for my dissertation research, and I came across all these fantastic collections from past, but also which are continuously multiplying collections across various cities in India, which are very much alive and thriving. Uh, so yeah, so in terms of my relationship with Urdu, I think that has been what I think is a positive shift of unlearning a lot of things that you are kind of brought up on as a non-native speaker. In terms of what I think works when I translate, I think I enjoy translating colloquialisms. I enjoy translating the kind of multilingualism that exists in any Urdu text, and to be honest, in perhaps any South Asian text, because it is such a multilingual society. Each text is kind of populated by resonances from all these other languages that surround it. So I think I really enjoy that. It is very challenging because you're translating a very polyphonous text into essentially text in English. So, of course, it requires certain kind of inventiveness of problem solving, of how you can bring those resonances into the text. And I've used a lot of strategies in the past. I don't know, some of them work, some of them don't, but I think those are things that I um, enjoy bringing into the target text. In terms of what doesn't work, I think rhyme and poetry is particularly hard for me. Uh, Primarily, it's a personal reason. I don't really read poetry. I am more of a prose person. But yeah, I think meter and questions of rhythm and rhyme, I think those are very hard to translate from one language into another. So I think those are hard, as are questions of colloquialism and multilingualism, but those I just enjoy more than translating poetry, I would say. So yeah.
I
Did
absolutely
I give out
understand.
a part of your question?
No, 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 no. In fact, you even answered some of my next question because I was
Oh.
going to ask you about the colloquialisms, and I did notice that you have a very interesting way of dealing with some translating some colloquial terms, whether it's things like insults. I was very intrigued by how you translated those, or jokes, and I think humor is also something that's very, very difficult to bring across in a different language. Rhyme and rhythm and meter, I completely understand. I did notice that you had some rhyme in translation as well, and that's something that I enjoy, like in particular. So I really enjoyed discovering that. But I guess I was going to ask you about some of these translation decisions that you make, and you've talked about it. I think this the multilingualism that you talked about is very interesting, and it's so difficult to translate that into like a single language in English, and how do you then create those variations in language? And I think you've dealt with that in an interesting way. I wanted to ask, maybe at this point we can do a reading from your translation of Kalo to give like a flavor of your translation, and if you'd like to talk about some of those decisions, you can do that at the same time as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So, would you want me to read from the original and then the translation, or just the translation?
It'll be nice if you can do both.
Okay, okay, yeah,
Yeah,
I can do for sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that'll be nice.
Okay, so I have picked one small paragraph from Kallo, and then I'll read the original, and then maybe I'll read the translation that I did. So this is from the middle of the story. For those of you who might have read the story, the main character Mushtari Bano, one of the main characters, her husband has just brought in a second wife, and that's where the story is at. Um, so I'll read the passage now. वो रात किस गजब की रात थी, यानी दोनों तरफ थी आग बराबर लगी हुई। मुश्तरी बानों को किसी पहलू करार ना आता था। मगरिब के वक्त जो मुसल्ले पर बैठी तो इशा का वक्त हो गया। 3, 6 के 9 जाने कितने वतर पढ़ डाले। पैर सुन्न हो गए। बार बार सजदा सहव अदा करती, घबराकर जोर जोर से दुरूद शरीफ की तशबीह शुरू करती, मगर मियाँ के कमरे से उठती हयजानी आवाज़ों को ना दबा सकी, जो किसी पिस्तौल की गोलियों की मानिंद उनके जिस्म में छेद किए जा रही थी। 2 कमरों, एक बरामदे और बालिश भर के सहन पर मुश्तमिल इस घर में काहे का पर्दा था। दीवारें गोया कागज की थीं, क्या अंदर क्या बाहर। अंदर हजलाए अरूसी से ज्यादा किसी दंगल का मंजर था। दंगल में भी पहलवान बराबर वजन व मरातिब के होते होंगे। यहाँ तो हाकिम व महकूम और जालिम व मजलूम के दरमियान महाज आराई थी। कौन जीतेगा ये साफ जाहिर था। थोड़ी देर में सन्नाटा छा गया। हकीम के खर्राटे और अनवरी की दबी दबी सिसकियां उभरने लगी। मुश्तरी बानो, जो जरा ऊंघी भी ना थी, हेई अलल फलाह और अस्सलातुन खैरु मिनन नौमी सुनकर फजर की रकात बांधने लगी। दोबारा वुजू की चंदा हाजत ना थी। Thank you. And maybe I'll read the English version now.
Yes, thank you. That was
Uh,
beautiful also.
Thank you. Okay. Oh, what a frightful night that was. Like Dehelvi's famous line, the fire raged equally on both sides. Mushtari Bano tossed around in her bed but found no peace. She sat for the evening prayers and was still on the prayer rug several hours later. 3 or 6 or 9, who knows how many sets of prayers she offered even after the last one for the day. Her feet went numb. She prostrated herself over and over again to pray for forgiveness for the mistakes she made while praying. She started chanting verses from the Quran loudly on her rosary, but couldn't drown the excited noises that emerged from her husband's room and pierced her body like bullets. What privacy could that house offer with its 2 meager rooms, a shared patio, and a tiny courtyard? The walls were paper thin. The scene inside sounded more like a wrestling match than conjugal bliss. But even in a wrestling match, the competitors are proportionate in size and weight. Here it was like a battle between the ruler and the ruled, the oppressor and the oppressed. It was obvious who'd win. A deathly silence descended, and then the sound of Shutari's snores rose, along with Anwari's sobs. Along with Anwari's sobs. Mushtari Bano hadn't so much as yawned through the night. As-salat khair minan nom. At dawn, the muezzin sounded the call to prayer with the traditional Arabic proclamation. Prayer is indeed better than sleep, she thought, as she prepared to pray without needing any renewed ablutions.
Very interesting. It sort of also demonstrates how you brought in that multilingualism into the English. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that.
Yes.
I have one more question about Kallo, and then I want to talk about your latest book as well.
Yeah.
I was, when I was reading the short story, your choice of translating this story really felt like a kind of revival of like stalwarts like Chuktai and Tabassum, whose writings were considered so transgressive and subversive for their times, and explore these sort of themes of gender, queerness, desire, and complicate the setting of the home as it was. So I was curious to know how you bring your own sort of sensitivities and politics into your translation choices and process. And this is something, it's like a broader question, but do you feel the translation then, in some sense, is an endorsement of a text? Like when you choose that text, are you then sort of endorsing it, or does that not really have to do with your translation choice as such?
No, thank you. That's such a wonderfully rich question. I completely agree, and as would Samina Nazir, that the story kind of really builds on works like that of Ismat Chughtai and Wajida Tabassum. Incidentally, one of Wajida Tabassum's short stories, Zara Haur Upar, I translated, which was published in the Sahitya Academy Journal, Indian Literature. I translated it as A Little Higher. Um, but yeah, so the story is definitely full of resonances from these past texts, and I think that was for me the guiding point of translating the kind of things that you were mentioning, colloquialisms or insults or even compliments or euphemisms or things which are not very directly said. Because one thing that I must remember as a translator is that I'm completely outside this world. Uh, uh, Both because, not just because of not being a native Urdu speaker, but also because it's a very gendered space. It's a very space which is designated as feminine and, which is designated as having certain quirks and, internal grammar of its own, to the point that sometimes I often also would miss when reading, works like these by women authors. I would miss the implication of certain kinds of things. So I think my strategy while translating Kallo and strategy while translating Wajida Tabassum and for the future would be to take a very broad kind of view of every word that appears in that short story. Because the kind of insults, profanities, compliments, appreciation of beauty, language of eroticism that appears in these texts is not singular to these texts, but comes from this longer tradition, which you very kind of, astutely noted in your question. So when I was trying to translate, these kinds of languages from Kallo into English, translations that had been done of Ismat Chuktai and of Wajida Tabassum, which are plenty, and also went back to some of those texts to see how that particular word was being placed and used in that text, versus how Samina Nazir was employing it. So I think that kind of broader view of each kind of literary utterance within one text, situating it in this larger tradition of writing about the zanana, about, of writing about spaces that the reading public might not be privy to. I think that was my strategy instead of relying just on my instincts or on dictionaries. I think that's the other problem, because a lot of this terminology you cannot access from dictionaries at all, because they're not a part of um, that kind of dictionaries. Of course, there are dictionaries in Urdu, earlier dictionaries prepared in like early 20th century of what is called Begamati Zaban, the women's languages within the Zanana. So there are those dictionaries, but they also have a very strange kind of ethnographic take on, this kind of, it's both erotic and ethnographic, because it is trying to access a language that the male readers, do not have access to. So it's both judgmental and voyeuristic at the same time. So the strategy I used was to look at just other texts and how meaning was imputed in Chuktai and Wajida Tabassum versus Samina Nazir. um, and also, I think Pakistani dramas is also a very good point. As in, it might sound frivolous, but Samina Nazir herself is quite a great actress. She has worked in a lot of Pakistani dramas, and a lot of these kinds of languages that we see here appears in a very different format in those on television and in films and things like that. So that was like my larger guiding matrix. To your second question about endorsement, I would say, I would also point out that while Samina Nazir is a part of the legacy of Chuktai and Wajida Tabassum, uh, as a reader who loves both Chuktai and Wajida Tabassum, I would also say that Samina Nazir takes it one step forward. Because in Chuktai and Tabassum, queerness is often a way of critiquing seclusion, as per their own words. Chuktai famously, in the introduction to her novel, The Crooked Line, wrote that, the kind of things that she's describing, unnaturalness, is a result of, is because she wants to critique the principle of seclusion. And similar kind of pattern one can see in Wajida Tabassum. Of course, that doesn't discount the fact that queer readers have done a lot with those kinds of texts in the future. Samina Nazir, on the other hand, what struck me in Kallo was the kind of humanity that she imbues in these queer characters. It doesn't just become a way of critiquing patriarchy in the abstract, but it imputes real feelings both to Mushtari Bano and Kallo. So I think she also represents a development in the tradition. In terms of endorsement, I would say then, yeah, I would endorse Samina Nazir's text, but I don't think translation necessarily involves endorsement, because as a translator, you might also think that you want readers to read certain kinds of texts without necessarily endorsing each and every part of that kind of identity. I would say that about Chuktei. I would say that about Tabassum. They're all texts that need to be absolutely translated, but a translator might not be endorsing all of them fully. And anyway, translation is such an intimate encounter with the text that you end up disagreeing with so many things, because you're really doing a close dive. You're not just reading the text once and then moving on, but you are really spending a ridiculous amount of time with it. So, like any intimate relationship, I think you are bound to develop disagreements with it. So, I don't think translation necessitates endorsement, is my view. Yeah. Sorry, was that too long? I feel like I spoke for too long.
No, not at all. It was great.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
perfect.
Okay.
No, thank you so much for nuancing that thought and also putting it in a sort of broader context. I think it's really amazing that you actually have that context when you're translating this because you're sort of aware of the larger tradition as well. And I had thought about the gender sort of question. What I hadn't thought about was this you translating sort of vocabulary that may not be standardized and not being able to access dictionaries, for instance, like you said. That's a really interesting challenge also. And I wanted to ask then, as a result of that, what your thoughts are. I mean, we talked about endorsement, but do you think translation then is a way of sort of providing a sense of agency to either marginalized or forgotten voices or a community, or even like marginalized or forgotten languages and dialects? I remember your answer reminded me of this Dastan Goi performance I had attended many years ago, where um, the performer talked about these women's dialects in Urdu, and I think she was talking about the Bagmati Boli, if I remember correctly, and how it has these, double meaning sort of words and these things which really become euphemisms then and are only accessible to people from the Zanana. And I think it would be so interesting and so challenging actually to translate that without having that vocabulary or that kind of those kind of secrets in the English language. So, really interesting. So, yeah, I'm curious about whether you think translation then is a way of providing a sense of agency to marginalized, forgotten voices, languages, dialects. And then the next question is sort of if you see your translation work as a form of activism and how you see your own positionality within this sort of framework.
Yeah, absolutely. I thank you. That's a very important question. I think that yes, definitely translation is a way of providing voices to you know texts, authors, languages, dialects that have become marginalized from the mainstream, and in that sense, it definitely can be a form of activism. But at the same time, I also think that one has to be very careful, like I guess with any kind of activism, of keeping both domains in mind, because what often happens when you're trying to resurrect a voice from what you think is a marginalized language into the mainstream, I think you layer on a lot of representative weight on that particular text and kind of exceptionalize it. And I think in Urdu for a long time, voices like Ismat Chughtai or, Kurutalen Heather or, Khadija Mastoor later on, they were kind of advertised as lone voices of, women challenging patriarchy in what is a very patriarchal culture and, things like that. I think those kinds of missteps are common when you also start only emphasizing the activism part, because then you're trying to make the texts do a lot of representing of lives which are very complicated, which are very layered, which are very rich, and which are robust. We know that Ismat Chuktai, Khadija Mastoor, Kurutal and Heather, Rashid Jahan, they were not the only voices. There were innumerable voices of that sort that they were writing. Of course, one may love Chuktai over another author. That's another matter. But I think um, why I fear thinking of translation only as activism is, or I guess it has to be a more conscious and a more well thought out of activism, which is conscious of the fact that you are only able to represent a very small part of the domain that you are choosing to bring to the mainstream, and be conscious that there is a very wide network of texts that these authors are building on themselves, all of which you cannot represent in translation simply because of logistical difficulties. You cannot translate everything into English in that sense. So I think that consciousness or gesturing towards that larger domain, I think, is something that is important. So I think to answer also partly your previous question, what gets lost in translation, which is such a hackneyed, conversation as we know, in translation. I think the nuances of language is something that you can replicate in other languages by finding equivalences or other kinds of things, but that larger world of resonances with other text, other figures, other authors is, I think, something that is hard to preserve in a target language or bring into the, target language. Of course, increasingly translators have been, writing prefaces or notes and, things like that, which helps place that, individual text in that larger terrain. But I think that is something that has the danger of getting lost. And yeah, so when I think of translation as activism, to which I wholeheartedly agree, I think we also need to, it comes with a caveat of this politics of representation and the weight of representation on those individual texts.
Thank you. That's the most unique answer I've heard to what gets left out in translation. I think it's a really important thing to talk about. So thank you for saying that. Also, I realized that I spoke incorrectly. The dialect that I was talking about was the Begamati Zuban or Begamati Boli, which is a sort of women's dialect that I was referring to. Okay, so I do want to talk a little bit about your recent publication as well, the Chinese Mansion. And maybe first I'll ask you how it really came about, like your choice of this novel, and um, yeah, also maybe a little bit around your process of publishing this as well, because I'm guessing there are also listeners who may be wanting to publish their first translations or curious about the process of this whole sort of ecosystem of publishing translation. So maybe you can talk a little bit about it from that point of view as well.
Mhm. Absolutely. So, how I came upon the text is it's a very banal answer. I was asking a friend who's also based in the US about authors in Urdu who write kind of more avant-garde stuff, because I feel like I had been for very long reading the realist fiction of the Progressive Writers Association, which is great. I really like that as well. Progressive Writers Association, or kind of around that ambit. So one of the names I was given for people who are kind of experimental in their fiction is Siddiq Alam. When I picked up his novels and a couple of his short stories, I thought it was a very unique thing for me, because he's based in Bengal. He is based himself from he's from Purulia but based in Kolkata, and most of his novels are written in a very distinctly Bengali landscape, including the Chinese Mansion. And I think that is something that, again, talking of representation, doesn't get often represented in when Urdu gets translated into English. That Urdu also flourished outside North India, the Hindi Urdu belt, in locations such as, Bengal, Chennai, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra. So yeah, so I think that is what attracted me. But beyond that kind of geopolitical landscape, I think the novel itself is very interesting, because Siddiq Alam is influenced both by Urdu writers but also by so many global, kind of, networks of circulation like Marquez, Anton Chekhov, and many other people. Franz Kafka, Milan Kundera, who have been very actively been translated into Urdu by a lot of, very, stalwarts of Urdu writing and translating. So I thought it was a very interesting combination where you see a very distinctly local landscape of India represented in Urdu that doesn't often get moved into, English, but through, literary styles that are very global. So I thought it's a very interesting text which brings the local and the global together. So that's the reason why I picked the text. In terms of the process of publication, so avant-garde texts, already there's a little bit of difficulty, to publish them, because they're sometimes a little harder to read, sometimes a little traumatizing to read and things like that. Um, I also feel like translation for me, the publishing part of the translation process has been a series of coincidences. Meeting people who have access to understanding the world of publishing, who introduce me to other people. I think that has really been the way in which I have become introduced to this kind of world, which looks so opaque from outside. At the same time, I think there's also increasingly so many opportunities for young translators who are, outsiders to the world and might not know about the inner goings of the world, goings on of the world. So I attended translation workshop which was led by Daisy Rockwell in Sri Lanka. It was called the South Asian Literature in Translation, SALT. That's right, right? Yeah. South Asian Literature in Translation workshop, and they do workshops periodically. And it was such an amazing forum because you got to meet, as in, of course, Daisy Rockwell is such a big name in translating from Hindi Urdu, but also just so many other people who are translating alongside you, because translating can feel very solitary. But when you hear, these kinds of, you're at these kinds of workshops, you meet other people and you form connections. And I think you get some kind of training in professionalism of how to translate. Um, there are also increasingly fellowships that one can apply for as a translation. I think you are mentoring one yourself, and then of course platforms like Afterword, where you get to hear from translators beyond their prefaces and beyond, like, book talks and things like that, about how they went about in translating. I think, for me, coincidentally, I started translating when all these resources were increasingly becoming available, and I think those are what have helped me, because otherwise publishing is such an intimidating job. It feels so opaque from outside. So I think I took cues and information from conversations that I had in these workshops, or that I heard from platforms like Afterword, and other kinds of collation of resources. So yeah, I think that has been my publishing experience.
Thank you for saying that. And I guess what I'm hearing is that it's a good time to translate. Um,
Yes.
and it's very true that there are these incredible opportunities, whether by SALT at Chicago or the BCLT or the National Center for Writing. There are so many opportunities out there which people can access. And of course, I think the literary translation community is quite a robust and supportive community. And it's so true what you said about having access to that community, getting feedback, working in a group. I think translation can be just like a PhD. I think it can be a very isolating process.
Yeah.
So having this network actually, I think, really transforms the experience. So, yeah, thank you for saying that. Um, yeah, so before we wrap up, I do want to ask you what you're working on now. Are there any upcoming projects? And yeah, we'd love to hear more about what we can look forward to in translation from you.
Thank you. So right now, unfortunately, I am focusing on finishing my dissertation, which, as you know, someone who just finished, it's a very, very hard task. Of course, my dissertation itself involves thinking a lot about translation, as I was mentioning, and also translating, because I have, since I work with at least three languages, Urdu, Farsi, and Arabic, I think uh, I have to translate all of them into English for my dissertation as well, which is a very different kind of translation process than translating Kallo or a novel and things like that. In terms of the upcoming project, the one that I'm working on right now is this issue called Islamicate Multilingualisms of our department journal at the University of Michigan. So our department of the comparative literature department at University of Michigan, where I am a graduate student, has an in-house journal called Absinthe, World Literature and Translation. And each year they bring, they have two grad students guest edit a particular volume on a particular topic, and solicit translations from across the world, to be honest. So me and another cohort mate of mine, Rozia Araki, who works with Persian, Turkish, and Arabic, the two of us are working on this issue called Islamicate Multilingualisms. Um, the idea began with thinking about the larger Muslim world as grounded in translation practice. A very distinctly literary as opposed to a religious way of thinking about this geography together. So we draw, of course, on a lot of scholars like Shahab Ahmad and Manakia and others in thinking about this. But yeah, we wanted to think about the large stretch, from North Africa, West Africa to Southeast Asia, South Asia, parts of Europe. As a part of this Muslim world, not simply through religious affiliation, but through translation. So we have a lot of exciting translations in that, including an 18th century Sufi manual from Assamese, a colonial tale from Punjabi, a tale of learning how to write in one's own script from Amazigh from North Africa, which is the language spoken in Morocco before Arabic. It's that the indigenous language of that location. We have entries from Malayalam, from Farsi, from Turkish, from Armenian, and many other languages. So I think that's the current project. It will be out in December, and we are quite excited about it. It's more academic, I would say, in its orientation, but it has a lot of fun entries that one can read, um, um, from a very vast geography. In terms of long-term projects, I really want to kind of sidestep English while translating. And I want to also translate into Urdu and Hindi. Hindi maybe will take more time because I feel like even though that's my mother tongue, I have less exposure to literary translations in and from Hindi. But one project that I want to do is kind of translate uh, short stories from Persian into Urdu and Hindi. I think those two locations resonate so much with each other. They have so much shared with each other. But I think kind of, the proverbial colonial rupture has separated them. And even though there is translations from, Persian into Urdu, uh, and I mean modern Persian. Of course, the classical Persian, there's no dearth of translations into Urdu, but I mean like what is happening right now in modern Persian writing, which I enjoy reading a lot. There are certain translations by people like Shamsur Rahman Farooqi and things like that, but I feel like there's more that can be done there. So a long term project of mine is to translate from Farsi into directly into Hindi or Urdu, which is a challenging task. As someone who just translated into Hindi, I'm sure you would have more to say about that. And I haven't done it ever, but that's my kind of long term ambition for sure.
That's wonderful. I mean, it's commendable how many things you're doing along with your academic work. And I know how brutal that final stretch of the PhD is, so I can totally understand. But all of these projects sound amazing, and I'm going to follow up with you about the journal as well. The upcoming issue sounds really exciting. And yeah, like you said, this whole directionality in translation is also a very interesting thing to explore. And I think you'll also find that you make very different decisions when you change the direction of translation. So I'd love to hear about your experience with that also later on. I do want to, before we close the episode, I want to ask you three very quick questions in a new rapid fire segment that we have in this podcast. So I'm going to ask you three quick questions. Just say whatever comes to your mind first. Okay, so question one Urdu word that you wish English had.
Hmm. Okay, there are so many. But I think from the part that I just read, for example, I would say Goya, I think is a great word. It comes from Goftan in Farsi, which is to speak. And it's like such a nice kind of adverb, but also implying action. So, yeah, I don't think English has it.
I completely agree. I think there's like a whole constellation of meanings within that one word, and I'm always mesmerized by that.
Yes.
Okay, second question. Music or meaning, what to retain in translation?
Oh my God. I would say meaning just because I feel like as a non-reader of poetry, I anyway can't keep the music.
Fair enough. I will keep my thoughts to myself. And lastly, one book that you wish you had translated.
Hmm. I think Khadija Mastoor's Angan, as in Daisy Rockwell, has translated it as the woman's courtyard, and it's a magnificent translation. It's amazing. Not because I think I could do better or anything, but I just love the novel, and I think it's such a beautiful novel, and I've read it so many times. And if I were to translate it, I would have an excuse to spend even more time with it. So I think that's why Khadija Mastoor's Angan.
Great, those were great answers. Thank you so much, Jaideep. I'll wrap up our conversation here. But thank you so much for being so candid and also so erudite at the same time. I always really enjoy talking to academics who are also thinking about their translation practice so deeply. So it's been very, very rich and very nuanced, and I really appreciate that. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I look forward to continuing these sort of chats around translation in the future as well.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the platform because, as I said before in one of my answers, it's such an incredible platform for us, for emerging translators. So, thank you.
Thank you for saying that.